Hey guys, tonight we're going back to a stretch of trail in northern Colorado and to a Saturday morning in the fall of 1999 when a 3-year-old boy named Jaryd Atadero walked up the Big South Trail ahead of the adults who were supposed to be watching him, stopped to ask 2 fishermen whether there were any bears in the woods, and then walked on around a bend and out of the world. He was gone in the time it takes to lose sight of someone. More than 200 trained searchers, a dozen dog teams, professional trackers, a dive team, a fixed-wing search plane, and 2 helicopters could not find him. One of those helicopters came apart in the air above the trail and put 5 people in the hospital. It would be almost 4 years before anyone found anything at all, and what they eventually found made the questions harder rather than easier. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy these. No pressure, no guilt. And thank you for all the case suggestions, truly. We're now live on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you want to listen there too. Now dim those lights, get comfortable. This is a long one, and Jaryd's story deserves to be heard carefully. He was a kid who hated tying his shoes, so his father let him go out that morning with the laces loose. He liked to run ahead of people and duck behind a boulder and jump out and say boo. There is a photograph of him taken the day before he disappeared, and in it he is smiling the way 3-year-olds smile, which is to say with his whole face and no reservation at all. Let's step back for a moment. How does a small child disappear from a maintained trail in daylight within 100 feet of a dozen adults on a clear autumn morning with no wind and no storm and nothing to hide him? Why did more than 4 hours pass between the moment he was last seen and the moment anyone called for help? And when his clothing finally turned up 500 feet above the trail, on a slope that 2 fit grown men described as a scramble, why did almost nothing about the way it was found match the explanation that everyone had already settled on? Let's start from the beginning, and let's start with the place, because in this case, the place matters as much as anything. The Cache La Poudre River runs east out of the high country of the Front Range in northern Colorado, dropping out of Rocky Mountain National Park through a long, narrow canyon before it flattens out into the plains near Fort Collins. Colorado Highway 14 follows the river for most of that distance, a 2-lane road with almost no shoulder, pinned between the water on one side and rock on the other, curving so often that in places you cannot see more than a few 100 feet ahead of you. It is a beautiful drive and a genuinely dangerous one, and people who live in that canyon will tell you that the road has taken more people than the mountains ever have. Along that road, scattered between the campgrounds and the pullouts and the fishing access points, there are small resorts. Not resorts in the sense that word usually carries. A cluster of cabins, a main lodge with a store and a few rooms, a gravel lot, a propane tank, a hand-painted sign at the highway, places where you might rent a cabin for a weekend in July, buy worms and a soda and a fishing license, and drive back down the canyon on Sunday afternoon. In 1999, one of those places was called the Poudre River Resort, and it was owned by 2 brothers, Jaryd Atadero and his twin brother Arlen. About 15 miles west of that resort, higher and colder and further from the highway than anything around it, there is a trailhead. The Big South Trail begins at roughly 8,400 feet, follows the upper Cache La Poudre south and west for about 11 miles, and eventually crosses into the northern edge of Rocky Mountain National Park. It runs through the Comanche Peak Wilderness, part of the Roosevelt National Forest, a stretch of country that Theodore Roosevelt set aside at the beginning of the last century and that has changed remarkably little since. If you have never been on that trail, it is worth understanding what it actually is, because a lot of the retellings of this case get it wrong. This is not a paved interpretive loop with benches and railings. Butcher Schoening, a friend of Allen's who knew the trail well, described it as moderate with ups and downs and said you could take a child on it as long as you kept the child in line and held onto him. Then he described why. There were places, he said, where the ledge was only about 2 feet wide, with the loose shale running all the way down to the river. There were rock fields. He said that being a moderate trail, it was still pretty tough, and that if you were not in shape, it would take a lot out of you. That is the honest description. A trail that a healthy adult can walk without technical equipment, and that a 3-year-old can also walk, right up until the moment the trail narrows, or the ground turns to broken rock, or the drop to the water opens up beside you. The country on either side of the trail is steeper than the trail itself. Slopes rise off the corridor at 40 and 45 degrees in places, covered in talus and scree, which is to say fields of loose broken rock that shift under your boots and swallow sound. Above the scree there are stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. Below, in October, the river runs low and narrow and cold, with pools deep enough to stand in, but rarely deep enough to swim. And there are animals, elk and mule deer moving down out of the high country as the weather turns, black bears in the last weeks of feeding before winter, bighorn sheep on the exposures, bobcats, and mountain lions which live in that canyon in numbers that most visitors never think about, because a mountain lion in the Rockies is a creature you almost never see, even when it is watching you. Now picture the first weekend of October in that canyon. The aspens further up the drainages have gone gold and are already dropping. The mornings start below freezing and the afternoons climb into the 50s and 60s. The summer crowds are gone. Hunting season is a week away. Jaryd Atadero would later describe that particular Saturday as one of those gorgeous fall bluebird days in the mountains of Colorado. And if you have ever spent an autumn morning at 8,000 feet under a sky that color, you know exactly the kind of day he meant. Clear, still, cold in the shade and warm in the sun, and so ordinary in its beauty that nobody thinks to write anything down about it. That is the place. Have you ever wondered how much of what happens to people in the outdoors comes down to nothing more than which direction they happen to be looking? Hold on to that, because it is going to matter. Let's talk about who Jaryd was, because he is very easy to lose inside this story, and that would be the worst thing we could do to him. Jaryd John Atadero was born on the 2nd of January, 1996. On the morning he disappeared, he was 3 years and 9 months old. He weighed about 35 pounds. He had dark brown hair and a round face and the kind of grin that shows up in almost every surviving photograph of him, because apparently he did it constantly. His father described him simply as a wonderful kid who always smiled, which is the sort of thing every grieving parent says, except that in Jaryd's case, the photographs back it up. He had an older sister, Jocelyn, who was 6 that autumn. The two of them were being raised by their father after his divorce. Their mother, Stacy McKissick, was living in San Diego. Jaryd Atadero was 41 years old, a physical education teacher who had spent his career in Colorado schools, and by every account, a man who took the job of being a single father extremely seriously. He had also, in the period before that October, become involved with a group called the Christian Singles Network, a faith-based social organization for single adults that ran outings and gatherings, and in his case, provided a kind of extended family that a divorced man raising 2 small children on a teacher's salary badly needed. And then there was the resort. Alin and his twin brother Arlin had bought the Poudre River Resort up the canyon on Highway 14, and Alin had moved his kids up there. Years later, he tried to explain what drew him to that canyon, and it was not the business. It was the trees, he said. There is stuff out there, he said, but it is interesting because you become part of the Poudre Canyon right there. He talked about the hours. They opened at 6 in the morning and closed at 11 at night, which is a punishing schedule for anybody, let alone a single parent. But he did not describe it as a hardship. He said that not only did the place take care of them financially, but how many people get the opportunity to be right next to their kids 24 hours a day. There were employees at the resort and there was family around, he said, but really, there were only 3 of them, Jocelyn, Jaryd, and himself. They knew that they were the family. Now picture that place in the last week of September. A small store with a cooler of drinks and a rack of fishing tackle and a counter where a 3-year-old could sit on a stool and watch people come in off the highway. A gravel lot with a couple of trucks in it. A row of cabins under the pines with the river running behind them, loud enough that you stop hearing it after the first day. 2 kids who have the entire canyon as a backyard, and a father who is 30 feet away from them at all times because his workplace and his home are the same building. There is something almost unbearable about how good an arrangement that was. It was the safest possible version of that life, and he was not a distracted parent. He was, if anything, the opposite. Jaryd had a few habits that everyone who knew him mentions. He hated tying his shoes. He would put them on and refuse the laces, and his father, picking his battles the way parents do, generally let it go. He wore a pair of white and grey nylon tennis shoes with Tarzan on them, the Disney film that had come out that summer. And those shoes are going to matter later in a way nobody could have imagined. He also had a game. He would run ahead of whoever he was walking with, get out in front by 20 or 30 feet, and then hide behind a rock or a tree and wait. And when they came around, he would jump out and shout boo. Anyone who has spent time with a small child knows this game. It is not unusual. It is not a warning sign. It is what a confident, happy, physically capable 3-year-old does with an adult he trusts, over and over, until the adult stops finding it funny, and he was friendly to the point of being indiscriminate about it. He was the kind of small child who walks up to strangers and takes their hand. That detail comes up more than once in this case, from more than one direction, and it is worth sitting with for a second. A 3-year-old who is not afraid of adults is a 3-year-old who has been treated well by adults. It is a good sign about the life he was living. It is also, in a different light, the most frightening detail in the entire story. There is one more photograph worth mentioning. It was taken on the 1st of October, 1999, the day before he vanished. In it, he is 3 years old and healthy and grinning, and there is no information in it at all, which is exactly why his father kept it and why every news organization in Colorado eventually ran it. Have you ever wondered what the last ordinary photograph of a person looks like? It looks like nothing at all, And that is the whole point. Let's talk about that Saturday. In the fall of 1999, a group from the Christian Singles Network was staying at the Poudre River Resort. The arrangement was informal and mutual. The group was helping Alan get the property ready for winter, doing the kind of work that has to happen at 8,000 feet before the snow comes, and in exchange, they had somewhere to stay. Some of them Alan knew well, some he knew a little, and some he had met for the first time that week. On the morning of the 2nd of October, the group decided to go and see the fish. There is a state fish hatchery a short distance from the resort, a couple of miles at most, and Alan described it as being right around the corner. It is exactly the sort of place you take children on a Saturday morning in the mountains. Concrete raceways full of trout, a walkway, a coin machine full of pellets, water running through everything, and the whole visit takes 40 minutes. Jocelyn asked first. She came to her father and asked if she could go and see the fish, and she would be going with a close family friend who was part of the group, someone Alan trusted. He said yes. And then, of course, Jaryd asked, and Alan recalled the moment almost word for word years later. He said he gave permission for Jocelyn to go, not knowing that Jaryd would immediately say, "Gee, Dad, if she can go, why can't I go too?" That is the entire mechanism of this tragedy, right there, in a sentence that has been said in 10 million households on 10 million Saturday mornings. Alan hesitated. This part matters, and it gets flattened in a lot of retellings, so let's be precise about it. He was not casual about letting a 3-year-old go off with a group. He asked where they were going, and he was told the hatchery, only the hatchery. On that understanding, and on the understanding that people he trusted were going along, he agreed. He later said that he let Jaryd go and he assumed that was where they were going. He got his son ready. Jaryd had his shoes on and he hated tying them, so his father did not make him tie them. He had a fleece coat, green and beige, long-sleeved. He had royal blue pants. Somewhere in that gravel lot, at some point before 10 in the morning, he got into a vehicle with a group of adults and his big sister, and his father went back inside to run the store. That was the last time Jaryd Atadero saw his son. 11 adults, 1 6-year-old and 1 3-year-old, left the Poudre River Resort at around 10 in the morning. And somewhere between the resort and the hatchery, the plan changed. Nobody has ever fully explained why. It was not sinister, and there is no evidence that it was anything other than what it looks like, which is a group of adults on a beautiful morning deciding in the moment that they would rather do something better than look at concrete tanks full of trout. Alan himself speculated that the weather did it. It was one of those gorgeous fall bluebird days, he said, and if you have ever been in the mountains on a morning like that, you understand the pull. So instead of stopping at the hatchery, they kept driving. West on Highway 14, up the canyon, past the campgrounds and the pullouts, 15 miles beyond the resort and roughly 60 miles west of Fort Collins, to a gravel parking area at the head of the Big South Trail. To be fair to every person in that vehicle, none of them did anything that a great many decent people have not done on a nice morning. And to be equally fair to Jaryd Atadero, he had no idea. He was standing behind a counter 15 miles down the canyon, believing his children were looking at fish. You're standing in that parking area at the head of the Big South Trail on the 2nd of October, 1999. It is a little after 10 in the morning. The lot is gravel and mostly empty, and there's still frost on the grass in the shade at the edge of it. The air is thin enough that you notice it when you shut a car door. There is a wooden marker with the trail number on it, and beyond that, the path drops into the lodgepole and out of sight within about 40 yards. Somebody is retying a bootlace. Somebody else is standing there deciding whether to carry the jacket or wear it, which is the wrong question at that elevation, and almost everybody gets it wrong. 2 children are already out in front of the adults, because children are always already out in front of the adults, and 13 people who have never hiked together before, with no plan, no assigned buddy, no head count, and no particular leader, walk into a wilderness area larger than some entire counties on a beautiful morning with a whole day ahead of them. Nothing about that scene would make you look twice, and that is exactly why it is worth describing. They parked at the trailhead and they started walking. Bill Nelson, who was then an emergency services specialist with the Larimer County Sheriff's Office and who would later retire as undersheriff, described what happened next in the plainest possible terms. The church group went up to the Big South Trail, he said. They parked at the trailhead, and they started walking on the trail. They began to separate or spread out as they walked. Some people are faster, and some are slower. That is how every group hike in the history of group hikes has gone. 13 people do not stay in a line. Within 10 minutes, there is a front and a back, and within 20 minutes, the front and the back cannot see each other, and nobody thinks anything of it because nobody ever does. According to Nelson, one adult, with Jaryd's sister and Jaryd, seemed to be out ahead of everybody else. So put yourself on that trail. You're on the Big South in the first week of October, 1999. The path is dirt and root and broken stone, running roughly parallel to the river below you on the left, climbing gently. The sun is coming through the lodgepole in long bars, and the air still has the cold of the night in it, wherever the light does not reach. You can hear the river the whole time, loud enough that conversation takes effort, loud enough that someone 30 yards ahead of you would have to shout to be heard. There are numbered backcountry campsites along the trail, 16 of them in total, marked with small wooden signs. You pass the first one. The trail narrows in places to a ledge with loose shale falling away below it, and then it opens out again into a rock field, and then it goes back into the trees. Somewhere along the way, Jaryd picked up a stick, a makeshift walking stick, the way small children do, and he was carrying it, and he ran ahead. He was doing what he always did, which was to get out in front and hide and jump out and say boo. Investigators later described exactly that. He ran up the trail in order to duck behind boulders and trees so he could jump out from his hiding place. Reports vary on the precise geometry of the next few minutes, and that variation has never been fully resolved. It is generally accepted that the group had split into a faster set and a slower set, and that Jaryd ran ahead of whichever group he was with. Some accounts say he was no more than 100 feet in front. What is not clear, and what a Larimer County search and rescue report explicitly noted was not clear, is whether Jaryd at that moment was between the two groups or out in front of the faster one. That distinction sounds academic. It is not. It is the difference between a child who is briefly out of sight of adults, ahead of him and behind him, and a child who is out in front of everybody with nothing but trail in front of him. At around 11:30 in the morning, about 1.5 miles up from the trailhead, Jaryd walked up to 2 men who were fishing the river. They were the last people known to have seen him alive. What they described is the most ordinary exchange imaginable. A small boy came up to them near the second-numbered campsite, and he asked them a question. He asked if there were any bears in the woods. Think about that question for a moment, because he was not lost, and he was not frightened. He was 3 years old, and he was out in front on a big adventure in a big forest, and the thing on his mind was bears, the way bears are on the mind of every small child who has ever been taken into the woods. There's nothing in that question except a kid having a good day. The fishermen did not think anything of it, and it is worth being fair to them about why. They told investigators that they had seen a group of hikers about 50 to 80 feet down the trail. From where they stood, this was a child with his people, running a little ahead the way children do. They had no reason on earth to suppose that the group they could see had never heard of him. They also described the stick he was carrying. Then they went back to fishing. The last they saw of Jaryd, he was walking quickly up the trail, past the sign for Camp 2, away from the river and around the bend. That is where the record ends. Everything after that point is inference. Not long afterward, several members of the group heard a scream. Jocelyn heard it too. She was 6 years old. Years later, her father asked her about it, and the way he described the conversation is the single most haunting exchange in this entire case, precisely because of how carefully he asked and how honestly she answered. He asked her what kind of scream it was. Was it like somebody getting attacked, or somebody playing with someone? And she said it sounded like a playful scream, like someone was going up to tag him. That is a 6-year-old giving a genuinely careful answer to an impossible question. She did not embellish it. She did not turn it into something it was not. She said it sounded like play. We do not know what that scream was. We do not know whether it was Jaryd at all. It has been used to support almost every theory anyone has ever advanced about this case, which is usually a sign that a piece of evidence is not actually telling us very much. But somebody screamed on that trail that morning, and then a 3-year-old was gone. It took a while for anyone to understand that he was gone. Bill Nelson described the gap with an investigator's precision and without any apparent desire to make anyone look bad. As Jaryd, as a 3-year-old, is running and playing and having a good time, he said, there was something like 10 to 20 minutes worth of time when the adult with him lost track of him. The adult realized they had not seen him for a while, and when they went up to try and find him, they kept going, thinking they would catch up, and they did not catch up. That is how it happens, and nobody makes a decision to lose a child. The gap opens by 1 minute at a time, and every one of those minutes has a perfectly good reason attached to it. By around 12:15, the group understood that Jaryd was missing. And here is where the story stops being about the wilderness and starts being about people, because what happened over the next 4 hours is, for a lot of people who have studied this case, the hardest part of it to accept. The group searched for him themselves. For about an hour, 13 people spread out along that trail, calling a 3-year-old's name. Then some of them got into a vehicle and drove 15 miles back down the canyon to tell his father. Nobody called anyone. There were no mobile phones worth speaking of in that canyon in 1999, and coverage would have been non-existent even if there had been. That is a real constraint, and it deserves to be stated plainly. But there was a trailhead register, there was a highway, There were other vehicles, and there was a 15-mile drive to the nearest telephone that somebody could have started the moment the situation was understood, rather than an hour later. Jaryd Atadero was behind the counter at the resort when they came in. The way he described the next few seconds has never left anyone who has heard it. He ran to his car. He asked where they were, and they told him 15 or 16 miles up the road, and he could not process it. "How did you get that far up the road?" he asked them. He was getting into his vehicle and beating his own chest and screaming the same sentence over and over. "They lost my baby. They lost my baby." He drove up the canyon and he went up that trail and he searched for another hour on his own, shouting his son's name into a river loud enough to swallow it, until he stopped somewhere on the trail and understood the shape of what he was standing in. "And I'm not sure exactly how far we got up the trail," he said later, "but I stopped and realized, oh my God, this is not what I thought it was. I just can't get up here and find him." It was around 4 in the afternoon when he came back down to the lodge to call for help. His resort manager had already made the call. At 26 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, a pager went off, and Bill Nelson learned that there was a missing 3-year-old in the Poudre Canyon. At 7 minutes past 5, a second page went out to George Jansen, the manager of Larimer County Search and Rescue. The gap between those 2 pages was not a delay in any meaningful sense. It was standard procedure, built in to allow the mountain deputy to reach the scene and confirm that a search was actually warranted before dozens of volunteers dropped whatever they were doing and drove into the canyon. By 6:30 in the evening, search personnel had reached the lower Big South Trailhead. Around 65 search and rescue members were deployed that first night. Nelson's expectation, and he has been candid about this for 25 years, was that this would be over quickly. "Absolutely. I thought we would find him," he said. "Yes, it was a young child. But my thought was that we should be able to get in there with our people and do what we do and what we have done hundreds of times, which is find the person. It might take a few hours to find the child crying or hiding someplace nearby, but we would be done before midnight. That is not arrogance. That is experience. Small children who go missing on trails are almost always found close by, usually downhill, usually within a few hundred yards, usually within hours, because a 3-year-old does not have the range or the endurance to get far. The statistics on lost child searches are overwhelming on this point. He should have been found before dinner. By 8 in the evening, teams working up from the lower trailhead and down from the upper trailhead met each other somewhere between the 7th and 8th campsites. They had covered the corridor between them, and they had found nothing at all. Not a shoe, not a stick, not a footprint anybody could be certain of. The search plan was expanded and more resources were ordered, including a helicopter requested for first light, and the temperature began to drop. This is the part of the first night that everybody involved has carried since. It went below freezing in that canyon after dark, as it does at 8,400 feet in October, and somewhere out there, if he was alive, was a 35-pound child in a fleece coat and untied nylon tennis shoes. Searchers walked the trail through the dark, deliberately making noise, calling and banging, on the theory that if he was out there and conscious, he would hear them and come toward the sound. Nobody came toward the sound. Now, put yourself on that trail after dark. The sun went down behind the ridge before 6, and the temperature in the drainage is falling through the 30s on its way below freezing. You have a headlamp and a radio and a section of trail to work, and the river is loud enough that you have to stop walking in order to listen properly. So every few minutes you stop and you shout a name into the dark, and then you stand completely still and listen to water. Above you, the slope goes up into the black at an angle you cannot see and would not climb at night if you could. Somewhere back in the trees, another searcher is banging a stick against a trunk because a sharp sound carries further than a voice does, and the thing you are doing all night is trying to give a 3-year-old something to walk toward. That is the entire theory of a night search for a small child. You do not expect to find him with your eyes. You expect him to hear you and come to you. Everyone on that mountain understood the arithmetic of a 35-pound body in a fleece coat at 8,000 feet in October, and nobody said it out loud, and they kept shouting until it got light. Bill Nelson went to his pickup truck just before midnight for a short sleep and told his people to wake him the moment they found the boy. He woke up in the front seat of that truck the next morning, and nobody had woken him, and he understood immediately what that meant. Down at the staging area, somebody had put Jaryd Atadero with one of the search dogs, a 6-year-old girl who had heard something on a trail a few hours earlier, sitting with her hands in the fur of a working dog named Apache, while adults with radios moved around her, and nobody told her anything because nobody knew anything. On the morning of the 3rd of October, teams were briefed to be especially vigilant at first light. The family had told searchers that Jaryd woke at dawn. If he had spent the night out there, dawn was when he would move. A dive team went into the Big South. The river in October is low and cold and mostly shallow, running fast through boulders with pools scattered along it. Divers went into those pools one at a time, feeling along the bottoms with their hands, which is the sort of work that nobody who has done it ever describes in detail afterward. And a military helicopter came down from Wyoming. It was a Huey out of F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Cheyenne. It made its first flight over the search area that morning, then flew to the Fort Collins Loveland Municipal Airport to refuel and came back up the canyon in the afternoon. At around 3:30, working up the Big South drainage with a full fuel load in thin mountain air, the aircraft ran out of margin. It stalled, dropped roughly 100 feet, and came down across the trail. There were 5 people aboard. 4 of them were Air Force. The 5th was Mark Sheets, a Loveland man and a member of Larimer County Search and Rescue, and he was not supposed to be on that flight at all. He had come in to relieve George Jansen, the search and rescue manager, and Jansen had suggested he go up with the crew to help work out ground search plans from the air. Sheets was the only person aboard who was not strapped into a seat. He was sitting on the floor with the door open, which is how you look at terrain, and he had skipped a helmet so that he could wear a headset and talk to the pilot. He said afterward that he told them over the intercom that they needed altitude now, and the co-pilot answered that he knew but he could not and that they were going in. To me, Sheet said, that was code for brace for impact. He watched the rotors come apart in the tops of the trees. Pieces of the aircraft sprayed out into the forest. He tried to pull the door shut and a severed tree limb came through the opening and struck the Air Force doctor on board, fracturing the man's eye socket. The fuselage broke into 3 pieces as it came across the trail. The engines, still running, kept running for hours afterward, out there in the middle of a wilderness area until the fuel finally burned off. The Air Force crew got themselves out. Sheets did not, because he was trapped and unconscious. Search and rescue members who had been working nearby ran to the wreck, kicked in a window, and pulled him out through it. He had a severe concussion. He had a 13-inch gash on one leg, an L-shaped tear that left his femur exposed. He had 3 broken vertebrae in his lower back and a broken shoulder. Injuries, he assumed, came from being dragged out through the window, which he has never once complained about. By 6 that evening, all 5 were off the mountain, 3 by air ambulance and 2 by ground. Everyone survived. 2 of them were badly hurt. Mark Sheets was not thinking about any of that in the days afterward. What he said, years later, was that he had wanted to do something useful. He had wanted to help Jaryd. Let's be honest about what that crash cost the search, because it is not a colourful side story. It is central. The helicopter was the only tool the operation had for looking at the ground that human beings could not get to. The Comanche Peak Wilderness, above that trail, is tailless and scree and blow down at angles that ground teams simply do not walk across, not because they are unwilling, but because doing so puts a searcher in the hospital and turns a rescue into 2 rescues. Aerial search was how you covered that country. And on day 2, the aircraft assigned to do it was in 3 pieces across the trail, and the entire crash site had to be closed off and secured by the Air Force, which meant that a chunk of the search area was now an accident investigation site. A second helicopter, a Larimer flown by a Fort Collins company, came in the following day and ran into swirling winds in the drainage that required full power just to stay out of the rocks. It went back to Fort Collins. Justin Smith, who was then a sergeant with the Larimer County Sheriff's Office and who would eventually become the county sheriff, was handling press. He has described the second day with real feeling. "We quickly realized what we were up against," he said. They had searchers coming out on stretchers. They had a missing child who had now been out overnight. And they had the Air Force closing off a crash site. Emotionally, it was overwhelming, he said, and you could see it in the eyes of everybody involved. And then the media arrived, and the search became something else entirely. Understand the moment. This was Colorado in the autumn of 1999. The grand jury looking into the death of a 6-year-old girl in Boulder had just postponed its announcement about whether it would return any indictments, and every satellite truck in the state suddenly had nothing to point at. Then a 3-year-old vanished in a national forest 60 miles west of Fort Collins. At one point, there were 17 satellite trucks lined up along Colorado Highway 14. Smith described anchors in fur coats walking around a gravel pullout in the mountains, and anybody and everybody calling the sheriff's office for information. Psychics arrived and telephoned and wrote, each of them certain they knew where the boy was. A barefoot man showed up at the search site with a mule, ready to go and track the child down. A Native American man came and performed a ceremony asking the mountain to give up the boy. Jane Zmijewski, who worked the search with the Larimer County Canine Unit, put it simply. It was very intense, she said, and very media-friendly, with press everywhere and CNN on the Canyon Road. It became a nationwide episode that put a lot of stress on the searchers and on the dogs. Jaryd Atadero, standing in the middle of all of it, later found the only words that fit. It became a tornado, he said, a hurricane, and the biggest storm in all of our lives. Sheriff Jim Alderton made a decision early on that shaped everything that followed. He treated the area as a crime scene. His reasoning was defensible on its face. If a child had been taken by a person, then the ground around that trail held evidence, and the fastest way to destroy evidence is to walk 200 untrained volunteers across it. So he restricted the search to trained search and rescue personnel and turned away the enormous wave of well-meaning people who wanted to help. To be fair to him, every incident commander in the country would tell you the same thing about scene integrity. And to be fair to the people who were turned away, some of them were not amateurs. Members of Jaryd's own family later said that experienced dog handlers and trackers were sent home without anyone taking a name or a number in case they were needed later, and that 2 men who had tracked with Army Special Forces were treated dismissively, one of whom pointed at an area above the trail and said he thought the boy could be found up there. The family also said they were reduced to learning about developments in their own son's case from the Colorado press, and that at one point relatives got onto the trail by presenting themselves as a bird-watching group. Those are family accounts made by people in the worst days of their lives, and they have never been formally adjudicated. But they have been consistent for 25 years, and they matter, because they describe the atmosphere in which decisions were being made. The search went on. Over the following days, more than 200 trained searchers worked that drainage, along with a dozen dog teams, professional trackers, the dive team, and a fixed-wing aircraft flying passes overhead. Searchers went up the slopes and along the river banks. The dogs worked the trail corridor and the campsites. At one of the campsites, a tracking dog caught the scent of a mountain lion. By midweek, the weather had turned. Snow fell intermittently, and the night stayed at or below freezing, and the arithmetic that everybody had been carefully not saying out loud became impossible to avoid. Justin Smith told reporters that there were no indicators to rule anything in or rule anything out, which is the most honest sentence anyone said during the entire search. He did, however, quietly play down the idea of abduction. On the Tuesday afternoon, a searcher took Jaryd Atadero up the trail to the place where his son had last been seen. He came back down about an hour before dark carrying 2 things. One was a plastic bottle he had filled with water from the river. The other was a walking stick, the one the fisherman had described. He stood in front of the cameras with those 2 objects in his hands. "I haven't lost hope," he said, and he was working to get the words out. "But it's a major task still, and I think I may never ever see my son again." At 7 in the evening on the 8th of October, the search was suspended for lack of any clue to follow. The family was told first. Bill Nelson summed up what they had done. They worked 8 solid days, 24 hours a day. They did some limited night searching, and they always kept people out in the field making noise so that if Jaryd was out there, he would hear it and respond or come toward it. Nobody found a footprint they could swear to. Nobody found a piece of clothing. Nobody found blood or a drag mark or a scrap of fleece on a branch. In 8 days, across one of the largest search operations in the history of that county, the total physical evidence recovered relating to the disappearance of Jaryd Atadero was nothing whatsoever. And here is something about Jaryd Atadero that tells you a great deal about the man. Standing in that parking lot as the search wound down, with every reason on earth to lash out at somebody, he said this about the searchers. No matter how hard they look, there's nothing, he said. It's not their fault that he's lost. And they made the best effort to find him. He would grow more critical later, and he had cause to. Years afterward, he said that he had been critical of them at the time as well. Because when you are in a survival situation, you want everything that can possibly be done to be done. And there were moments when he thought there was so much more they could have done. Both of those things were true at once, which is how grief actually works. Then the trucks went home, and the canyon went quiet, and the Atadero family began the part nobody prepares you for. Have you ever wondered what happens to a missing person case after the cameras leave? Mostly, nothing happens. That is the answer, and it is why families in this position so often end up doing the work themselves. Alan refused to hold a memorial service. He was very clear about why. He would not hold one until he knew what had happened to his son, and as far as he was concerned, until somebody could tell him something. Jaryd was missing and not dead. The family printed flyers with his photograph and the details of his disappearance and put them out through the canyon and beyond it, hoping that hunters coming into the national forest for the season, or hikers the following summer, might turn up something the search had missed. Larimer County Search and Rescue arranged to run training exercises in that same country, which is a quiet and rather moving thing for a volunteer organization to do. It meant that every time they practiced, they were also still looking, and the sightings started, because they always do. Reports came in from around the country. Someone had seen a little boy who looked like the photograph. Someone was sure. Most of them dissolved on contact with the most basic checking, which is what almost all such reports do, and which is not a criticism of the people who make them. One of them stayed with the family, though, and it is worth mentioning because of what it says about how Jaryd's father was living. The morning after the disappearance, a ranger at Mesa Verde National Park, hundreds of miles away in the southwestern corner of the state, reported seeing a small boy who resembled the child whose picture was on the news. What made it stick was a detail. The little boy kept running up to him and wanting to hold his hand. That was a thing Jaryd did. His father recognized it instantly. It was almost certainly a coincidence, and there is no evidence it was anything more than one small, friendly child being mistaken for another. But you can understand what it did to a man who had nothing else, and you can understand why he kept it. There was also something uglier. At some point, a man began contacting Jaryd Atadero, claiming to be Jaryd. Alan eventually took out a restraining order against him, and when the man violated it, he was arrested. Investigators came to believe he was either mentally ill or seeking attention, and the eventual DNA results ended the claim entirely. But for a period of years, a grieving father was fielding calls from someone insisting he was the child that father had been unable to find. And through all of that, Jaryd Atadero did something that most people in his position never manage. He turned outward. Within months, he was working on prevention. He talked to anyone who would listen about how families should behave in the outdoors, and the advice he gave was specific and practical and free of any grand theory. Make sure that when you go up, you come home. Travel with somebody. Carry a whistle. Tell people where you are going so that if something happens, they are not out there searching in the wrong place. That is it. That is the whole doctrine, and it has probably saved lives. In the spring of 2000, a bill was introduced in Congress to dedicate the Big South Trail in the Comanche Peak Wilderness area to Jaryd Atadero and his legacy of promoting safe outdoor recreation for children. The findings section of that bill states, in the flat language of federal law, that Jaryd Atadero, a 3-year-old boy from Littleton, Colorado, was last seen on the morning of October 2nd, 1.5 miles from the trailhead of the Big South Trail. It directs the Secretary of Agriculture to post an interpretive sign at that trailhead describing safe outdoor recreation with children, referring to the loss of Jaryd Atadero to underscore why those considerations matter, and including, for at least a year, a copy of the act itself and an image of the boy. It passed both houses and was signed into law in the autumn of 2000. 2 years after that, Colorado adopted its version of the Amber Alert, the missing child broadcast system that had begun in Dallas after the abduction and murder of a 9-year-old girl named Amber Hagerman. Jaryd Atadero had pushed for it, and he was in the room when the governor signed it. He noted, with the sort of quiet astonishment that people in his situation learn to notice, that the bill was signed into law on his birthday. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, about 6 months after the search was called off, he began writing things down, not for publication. He started journaling to cope, and because he wanted an accurate record of everything that had happened, so that one day he could tell his daughter the truth about it. He sent what he wrote to his twin brother Arlen, who worked on it and added his own recollections. Every January on the 2nd, the family bought a birthday cake and put candles on it and sang happy birthday to a little boy who was not there. 4 winters went by like that. And this is where the story shifts. In the first week of June 2003, 2 men from Fort Collins went hiking in the Poudre Canyon. Their names were Rob Osborne and Jaryd Was. The record varies slightly on whether it was the 4th or the 5th of the month, which tells you something about how these things actually happen, because nobody keeps careful notes on an ordinary Wednesday. They were not searching for anything. They were friends who hiked together, and their method was simple. They would pick an area of the canyon they liked the look of, and they would go and explore it. They had walked the Big South before. Rob described it the way anybody would. A gorgeous hike, a beautiful river, really a wild area. The reason he and his friend enjoyed hiking together in the first place. And they had talked about the case while they were up there, the way people in that county did. Whether the boy had been swept downstream, whether a mountain lion had taken him, or whether there had been something worse than either. On that particular day, they decided to leave the trail. They found themselves at the bottom of a rock field, and one of them said, "Let's go up the ridge." It is roughly a 2,000-foot climb from the trail to the top of that ridge, and they were not going all the way, but they started up. Gareth described the going. It was pretty much a scramble, he said. You are watching your feet, focused a few feet in front of you, so you do not twist an ankle. And then, as Rob put it, they just walked right into it. There was cloth on the rocks, not much of it, and weathered and scattered, but unmistakably clothing, in a place where clothing had no business being, and both men understood what they were looking at more or less immediately, because everybody in Larimer County knew what had gone missing on that trail. Then Rob saw the shoe. Gareth's description of it is the detail that has kept this case alive for more than 20 years. It was pretty pristine, he said. It was like somebody had just taken their foot right out of it. It was fresh. He said he half expected to look up and see a kid standing in front of him. They found the second shoe. They found a brown fleece jacket, and they found a pair of blue sweatpants that had been turned inside out, with one leg mostly gone, shredded and carried away in pieces. They were roughly 500 feet in elevation above the Big South Trail, on a slope running at 40 to 45 degrees, a little over a mile up the trail from the point where a 3-year-old had last been seen alive 3 years and 8 months earlier. They photographed what they had found, gathered up some of the items, and carried them down to the Larimer County Sheriff's Office. The photographs were emailed to Jaryd Atadero, who was by then living down on the Front Range, and he confirmed what everybody already suspected. The fleece was Jaryd's. The pants were Jaryd's. The shoes were the Tarzan sneakers he had been wearing on the 2nd of October, 1999. The next day, a team went up. It took them about an hour to reach the site from the trail near the second campsite. The clothing was spread across an area of roughly 25 feet. Some of it had been sheltered from the weather by rock and deadfall, and some of it had been fully exposed for 4 winters. What they observed is worth stating carefully, because almost every argument about this case comes back to it. The fleece jacket appeared to have puncture marks in it. The pants were tattered and torn, with a leg missing, and the nylon shoes showed very little weathering at all. Sheriff Jim Alderden held a press conference and said what the evidence appeared to him to say, which was that some sort of predator, a bear or a mountain lion, had killed the boy. He mentioned that dark and light hairs had been recovered from the pullover and would be sent to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation for analysis, noting that Jaryd's own hair was dark. He also confirmed that there were no visible signs of blood on the clothing. A wildlife officer with the State Division of Wildlife, Fred Quarterone, offered the arithmetic that made the theory plausible to the public. Mountain lions in Colorado can reach 150 pounds. Jaryd Atadero weighed 35. And then a forensic pathologist appeared on television and complicated everything. Dr. Michael Barden, one of the most widely known medical examiners in the country, was asked about the finding on air, and he was blunt. He was not persuaded, and his reason was not a hunch. If this was a predation event, he said, you would not find only clothing. You would find small bones inside the shoes. You would at least find a tooth. Whether or not that comment drove what happened next was that the sheriff's office sent a specialist team back up the mountain. On the 14th of June, 2003, members of the Larimer County Sheriff's Office, Larimer County Search and Rescue, the Colorado Division of Wildlife, and a forensic recovery organization called NecroSearch met at the Big South Trailhead at 8:30 in the morning. Jaryd Atadero went with them, along with personnel from a local child protection network. At 9:30, they had hiked the 1.5 miles and made the 500-foot vertical climb to the clothing site. 2 hours later, working the ground above and around it, they found 2 things. The first was a fragment of skull, the top of a small human cranium, wedged in a crevice in the rock. It was positioned in such a way that it was visible only from one narrow angle, and at the moment they found it, it was lit by a single shaft of sunlight coming down through the trees. There was some debris inside it. The second was a tooth. It was sitting on top of a log that spanned the crevice above the skull fragment in the open, with nothing covering it, after 3.5 years of Rocky Mountain winters. It was a lower molar. The lower jaw it had come from was never found. The site was about 180 feet north of the clothing and about 20 feet higher at 5 in the afternoon. Jaryd Atadero stood at the trailhead with the searchers and faced the cameras again in the same gravel lot and told the state of Colorado what they had found. The remains went for DNA testing, and the result was not what anyone wanted. The material was badly degraded, as anything would be after 4 winters at 9,000 feet, and the initial comparison came back at a probability of just under 89%. In forensic terms, that is not a match. It is not an exclusion either. It sits in the space in between, which is the cruelest place a result can sit. Alderton was straightforward about it. I'm sure that all concerned would have liked a more definitive answer, he said. He acknowledged that the DNA was significantly degraded from long exposure, but considering the DNA results together with the positive identification of the clothing, he said, "We are convinced that the remains are those of Jaryd Atadero." The tooth was consumed during testing. Years later, with better technology, the identification was confirmed absolutely. In November of 2003, the Larimer County coroner issued a death certificate for Jaryd Atadero. The manner of death was recorded as undetermined. The cause was recorded as a probable mountain lion attack. That word probable has been doing an enormous amount of work for more than 20 years. Let's talk about the search, because now we can measure it against the ground. According to the Larimer County Search and Rescue Report, searchers on foot never reached the elevation where Jaryd's skull, fragment, and tooth were found. That elevation is a little over 9,100 feet. In 8 days, with more than 200 trained searchers in the largest operation that county had ever run, nobody physically got to the piece of ground where he was. The report also notes something else. The Air Force helicopter would very likely have searched that area had it not crashed. Sit with that for a moment. The single piece of equipment capable of putting eyes on a slope that ground teams could not safely cross was destroyed on the second day of the search, and the ground it would have covered turned out to be the ground that mattered. There is a further detail that Bill Nelson has been honest about, and it is the one that has haunted the search and rescue community in that county ever since. The dogs alerted in that direction. There were canine alerts that went that way, Nelson said. He was not certain whether the alerts were right at the scree field or somewhere before it, but the dogs were at least indicating up that hill. That is why he remains reasonably confident that they searched it, because when a dog alerts like that, the response is to get up there and look. But we never found anything, he said. Both halves of that statement are probably true, and that is the tragedy of it. They were told by the dogs to go up, they went up, and they did not go far enough up, or they went up in the wrong line, or they crossed a slope of broken rock and simply did not look into the one crevice out of 10,000 crevices that held a fragment of bone visible from a single angle. When Rob Osborne went back up to the site with people who had been part of the original search, he said they were all scratching their heads. They had all been around that area. To be fair to every searcher who worked that mountain, and this needs saying clearly, we are talking about a scree field on a 45-degree slope in a designated wilderness area. What Osborne and Watts found by accident, they found by leaving the trail on a whim and climbing where no rational search plan would have sent a line of people. And they found it in June, on bare rock, with no snow and full daylight and nothing else to do, while the original search was working against falling snow, freezing nights, a closed accident site, and the clock that runs on a 3-year-old alone in the cold. The survival expert Les Stroud, who has spent his career thinking about exactly this, made the observation that applies to a great many wilderness cases. Search teams go over certain areas not once, not twice, but dozens of times. And then the person is found there a year later or a few years later. He has said he thinks something about that is beyond our understanding, and I would put it less mysteriously than he does. A mountainside is enormous, human attention is small, and a skull fragment is the size of a coffee cup. But there is one failure in this case that is not about terrain, and it is not about luck, and no amount of fairness makes it go away. Jaryd Atadero was last seen at roughly 11:30 in the morning. He was understood to be missing by about 12:15. The first call for professional help was made at around 4 in the afternoon. Search personnel reached the trailhead at 6:30 in the evening, 7 hours. That is the gap between a 3-year-old walking around a bend and a trained searcher taking a first step up that trail. Nobody in that group intended it. They did what people do, which was to look for him themselves and then to drive to the person who needed to be told. And both of those instincts are human, and neither of them is malicious. But in a lost child search, the first hour is worth more than the next 20 combined, because it is the only hour in which the trail is still warm, the scent is still fresh, and the search area is still measured in hundreds of yards instead of square miles. By the time anybody with a radio stood at that trailhead, the sun was going down. There is a body of knowledge sitting behind that sentence, and it is worth unpacking, because it turns a vague sense that the delay was unfortunate into a specific understanding of what the delay actually cost. Search planners work from behavioral profiles. They are built out of decades of recorded incidents, and they describe what different categories of lost person really do, because a lost hunter and a lost hiker and a lost older adult with dementia and a lost toddler all behave in completely different ways. The profile for a child of Jaryd's age is one of the most consistent in the whole literature. Very small children do not navigate and do not orient themselves toward anything. They do not climb for a view. They do not deliberately follow a drainage downhill toward a road. And a great many of them do not answer when their names are called, sometimes because they have fallen asleep, sometimes because they have been carefully taught not to talk to strangers, and sometimes simply because they are 3. What they tend to do is move until something stops them, and then stay near whatever stopped them. The distances involved are usually short, and the overwhelming majority are found close to the place they were last seen, which means the planners in that canyon were looking for a very small target that was probably not moving much and probably not going to answer on ground where the visible search corridor is a few yards wide and the river drowns out everything else. The thing that closes a search like that is speed. Scent is freshest in the first hours, and the ground a child could possibly have reached expands in every direction at once, so the size of the search area does not grow steadily. It grows by the square. A team on scene at 12:30 is working a circle a few hundred yards across. A team on scene at 6:30 in the evening is working several square miles of wilderness in failing light. 7 hours on that ground is not a delay. It is a completely different search. Let's talk about what might have happened, and let's do it properly, which means giving every theory the strongest version of its own argument and then giving the objections the same courtesy. Start with the official one. The Larimer County Sheriff's Office concluded, and the coroner recorded, that Jaryd Atadero was probably killed by a mountain lion. Justin Smith, who worked the search as a sergeant and later ran the office as sheriff, has never wavered on it. The way the remains were found, he said, was consistent with an abduction by a cat, and over the years nothing has come up to indicate anything else. The case for it is genuinely strong, and it deserves to be laid out without sneering. Mountain lions live in that canyon in real numbers. During the search, a tracking dog picked up the scent of one at a campsite along the trail. Jaryd Atadero himself, in the first days, told reporters something the searchers had found. They found cougar prints coming down toward his tracks, he said, and where the cougar prints and a little person's prints come together, the child's prints disappear. Jaryd weighed 35 pounds. An adult mountain lion in Colorado can weigh 150. To a cat that size, a child that size is not a fight. It is a deer fawn, and the behavior fits the location of the remains almost too neatly. A mountain lion that takes prey does not eat it where it fell. It moves it, often uphill, away from the disturbance and the smell of people, and it caches what it does not finish, tucking it into rock or under deadfall and covering it. The clothing was 500 feet above a busy trail on a slope humans avoid. The skull fragment was wedged in a crevice. That is what a cache site looks like. The fleece jacket appeared to have puncture marks in it. The pants were shredded and one leg was gone. Only a fraction of the body was ever recovered, which is exactly what you would expect after a predation event followed by 4 years of scavengers, rodents, birds, weather and snowmelt working over a mountainside. So that is the case, and it is not stupid. It is the explanation a wildlife biologist would reach for first, and it may well be correct. Now the problems, because there are several, and they are not trivial. The clothing was sent to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Jaryd Atadero summarized what came back and repeated it for the rest of his life. When they tested Jaryd's clothing, he said, there were no mountain lion hairs, no mountain lion DNA, no blood, and nothing at all on any of the articles of clothing. He also consulted people who study big cats, and what they told him was consistent. A lion attacking a small child would go for the abdomen and the internal organs. The jacket, they said, would have been in threads. It would not have survived. And the jacket, by the sheriff's own description in the photographs sent to the family, was largely intact. Then, there are the shoes. Investigators themselves remarked that they did not look like footwear that had spent 3.5 years in the Colorado wilderness, and they showed no scuffing of the kind you would expect if a body wearing them had been dragged 500 feet up a slope of broken rock. And then there are the pants, which were found turned inside out. That is the detail that has never gone away, and I want to be careful here, because both sides of it are reasonable. An animal pulling a small body out of clothing can absolutely produce an inside-out garment, in the same way that pulling a sock off a foot turns it inside out. That is not a fringe claim. But Jaryd Atadero spoke to more than one mountain lion expert who told him that lions do not remove clothing from a body and leave it on a mountainside, and certainly not neatly enough that a pair of pants comes off inverted and stays in one recognizable piece while the body itself is gone almost entirely. He also pointed at an internal contradiction in the explanation he was given. One account suggested that no blood or DNA was found on the clothing because the clothing had been removed before the attack, either by Jaryd himself or by something else. But if the clothing came off before he was attacked, Alan asked, why was it found 500 feet up the side of the mountain? To be fair to the forensic side of this, absence of blood on outer clothing after 4 winters at 9,000 feet is much weaker evidence than it sounds. A Colorado Bureau of Investigation analyst said as much at the time. Weather, wind, moisture, heat, and ultraviolet light all work to degrade and break down whatever biological material might have been on a garment, and 4 years is a very long exposure. The untied shoes, loose on the feet of a boy who refused laces, would also come away easily and without much scuffing, and a mountain lion of that size would carry a 35-pound child rather than drag him. So the physical evidence is ambiguous. That is the honest summary. It is consistent with predation, and it is not conclusive of it. And the coroner said as much by writing the word probable and leaving the manner of death undetermined. Dr. Michael Barden's early objection deserves a footnote here because it was resolved. He said that if a predator had killed the boy, you would find small bones in the shoes and you would at least find a tooth. A week later, NecroSearch found a tooth. What Barden's comment actually demonstrated was that the initial absence of remains was a genuine anomaly, and that when specialists went looking properly, the anomaly partly closed, partly and only partly. The tooth was from the lower jaw, and that lower jaw was never found, and neither was anything else. The second theory is the simplest one, and it was raised in the first week. Jaryd fell. He was 3. The trail had ledges 2 feet wide with loose shale running down to the river. If he had gone off one of those, caught himself in the rocks, been knocked unconscious or broken something, he would have been very hard to see from above, and he would not have survived the night. The problem with it is geometry. Everything that was ever found of Jaryd Atadero was 500 feet above the trail, on a slope so steep that 2 fit adult men described climbing it as a scramble and watching their feet the whole way. Rob Osborne was asked directly whether he thought a 3-year-old could have gotten up there under his own power, and the answer was immediate. No way, not all the way. It was a struggle for the 2 of them, and they were grown men in good condition. A child does not fall uphill. The third theory was the river, and it was pursued hard at the time. Dive teams worked the pools for days. The family has said that while the sheriff was publicly discussing predators, privately he told them he believed the boy had drowned, and that in water that cold it would be 5 years before a body surfaced. The clothing site closed that theory as well. Whatever happened to Jaryd, it did not end in the water below the trail. Which brings us to the fourth theory, and this is the one the family came to hold, and it needs to be handled with care. Jaryd Atadero came to believe that a person was involved. His reasoning was not mystical, and it was not vague. It was the inside-out pants. It was the shoes that looked too clean. It was the absence of blood or predator hair on any garment. And it was the position of the clothing, high above the trail in a place nobody would look, which he read not as a cache, but as a disposal. Myself and my family, he said, feel strongly that there is someone out there who knows a little bit more than we know. Here is what has to be said alongside that, and it is not a small thing. Investigators questioned everybody. They questioned Alan. They questioned the members of the Christian Singles Network group who had been on that hike They questioned the two fishermen who were the last people known to have seen the boy alive. They interviewed Jaryd's mother, who had flown in from San Diego when she heard, and they found, in the words of the reporting on the investigation, no red flags. No suspect has ever been identified. No one has ever been arrested or charged in connection with the death of Jaryd Atadero. Every person who was on that trail, in that vehicle, and in that family remains entirely uncharged and legally cleared, and they are entitled to be spoken about accordingly, which is to say, as people who lost a child on a mountain and have had to live with it, not as suspects in anything. There are also real problems with the abduction theory on its own terms. Any person who took Jaryd would have had to get him off a trail, up 500 feet of unstable rock, and then leave actual human remains at the site, which is a great deal of effort and risk and does not fit the profile of an opportunistic abduction. The remains that were found with the clothing. Whatever happened to Jaryd Atadero, his body was on that slope. And then there is the last theory, and I am going to address it directly because this case is one of the pillars of it. Jaryd Atadero appears in the Missing 411 series, the collection of wilderness disappearances assembled by the former police officer David Paulides, and around that framing has grown a much larger set of claims, some of them about unknown creatures, some about interdimensional forces, some about beings from somewhere else. If you search this case online, you will find people arguing in complete sincerity that a boy was removed from our world on the Big South Trail. I understand why. The details are strange. The shoes were too clean. The pants were inside out. The ground was too steep. The searchers were too good to have missed him. But strangeness is not evidence, and I think it is worth saying gently why that framework does not hold up. Cases are selected into it precisely because they are odd, which guarantees that the collection will look uncanny no matter what is actually happening. The criteria are applied after the fact. Thousands of people go missing in wild country every year. Almost all of them are found, and the small number who are not are, by definition, the ones where something unusual interfered with the search. When you gather only those, you have assembled a museum of coincidences and called it a pattern, and underneath all of it, there is a real boy and a real family, and the family did not need a mystery. They needed an answer. Have you ever wondered why unexplained cases attract the least disciplined explanations? I think it is because uncertainty is genuinely unbearable, and almost any story is easier to carry than no story at all. Jaryd Atadero carried no story at all for 25 years, and he did it without ever once claiming to know. There is one more piece of context, and it arrived very recently. On the 1st of January 2026, a 46-year-old woman named Kristen Marie Kovacs was hiking alone on the Crozier Mountain Trail near Glen Haven in the same county, about 7 miles from Estes Park. Two hikers coming along the trail saw a mountain lion lying partly across a person on the ground about 100 yards away. They threw rocks until the animal moved off. One of them was a physician, and he checked her and could not find a pulse. The Larimer County coroner determined that Kristen Kovacs had died of asphyxia from compression of the neck, and that her injuries were consistent with a mountain lion attack. It was the first confirmed fatal mountain lion attack in Colorado since 1999. Since 1999. Which is to say, the last one on the record was Jaryd. That case does not prove anything about what happened on the Big South Trail, but it does something useful, which is to correct the instinct that this kind of death is so vanishingly rare that it cannot be the explanation. It is rare. Across all of North America, there have been roughly 30 reported fatal mountain lion attacks since the 1860s, and in a given year, the continent might see 4 to 6 attacks of any kind and fewer than 1 death. Rare is not the same as impossible, and the same county proved it again 26 years later. Let's talk about what happened to the people who were left. When the remains were finally released, Jaryd Atadero did not bury his son, and he did not have him cremated. He kept him. Jaryd's bedroom stayed as it had been, and in a basement room decorated in the theme of the Poudre River Resort, the place he had once owned and could never quite let go of, he kept a white cardboard box. A reporter sat with him 20 years after the disappearance and watched him open it. Inside, there was a toy tank, an Oakland Raiders hat, and a Star Wars toy, and there was a clear plastic bag holding the top of a small human skull. "I know it seems weird and some people might not understand," he said, and he was crying by then, "but this is all I have of him. It's sad. Kinda surreal to think that this is my son. I have thought about that room a great deal while putting this together, and I have decided that there is nothing weird about it at all. A man who was told for 4 years that his child had simply ceased to exist was eventually handed back one small piece of him, and he was not going to put it in the ground and walk away from it. He put it with the toys. His faith carried him through in a way that he described without embarrassment and without insisting anyone else share it. I am at peace," he said, "and I know I am going to see Jaryd again one of these days. I'm going to look at him and say, 'Jaryd, what happened?' And he's going to look at me and say, 'Dad, does it really matter?'" The journal he had started 6 months after the search was called off eventually became a book worked on with his twin brother Arlen, and then a second, longer edition. 386 pages about what happens to a family after a Saturday morning goes wrong. He had never intended to write anything. He had wanted a record his daughter could read one day. Jocelyn grew up carrying something no 6-year-old should have to carry, which is the memory of a sound. She is reported to have told her father at 9 years old that she would rather know that her brother had died on that mountain than spend the rest of her life searching. Whether or not those were exactly her words, it is a hard, clear, generous thing for a child to say to a grieving parent, and it is roughly the position her father eventually arrived at himself decades later. Every January, the family bought a cake and sang. The public side of it kept growing, and Congress dedicated the trail. A sign went up at the Big South Trailhead describing how to take children safely into the outdoors, referring to the loss of a 3-year-old to explain why any of it matters. Colorado adopted the Amber Alert with Jaryd Atadero pushing for it, and the governor signed it on his birthday. A later governor declared a Recreational Safety Awareness Week in Jaryd's honor, and Jaryd was given the proclamation to carry to the middle school where he was teaching. Larimer County built outdoor education around the case, teach children to carry a whistle, dress them in bright colors so they can be seen from a distance and from the air, and teach them the single most important instruction in wilderness survival for a small child, which is that if you are lost, you stop walking and you stay exactly where you are. Justin Smith, by then the sheriff, said that in a 35-year career, this was one of the few cases you never lose. He said the search and rescue team in that county is haunted by it. There were a lot of reasons to lose hope, he said, but he was moved by how many people came together and worked so hard to try to find Jaryd and bring him back. Mark Sheets, who went into the trees on the second day of the search and came out with a shattered back and his femur showing, worked another 18 years and retired in 2017. What he wanted people to understand about that afternoon was not the injuries. It was that he had wanted to do something useful. Alan kept teaching. He spent 35 years in Colorado classrooms and was named a Teacher of the Year in 2019. Eventually, he remarried, and he and his wife, Deborah, moved to Ohio, where he became a middle school principal. At the 25th anniversary, in October of 2024, he sat down with a Denver television station and talked about it again, the way he had talked about it every October for a quarter of a century. It's like it happened yesterday, he said. It's etched into my mind. He was asked whether he still wanted to know what happened, and what he said was that he had stopped looking for the answer. He could still be an unsolved mystery, he said of his son. We don't know for certain what may have happened to him. There are several theories, and I don't think about them anymore. I don't, because now I know where he is, and in my heart he's in heaven. Then he said something that I think is the closest thing this case has to a resolution. Jaryd did not vanish for no reason at all, he said. He vanished to help others, and at a young age, if he managed to help others, God bless the little guy. 6 months later, on the 15th of April, 2025, Jaryd Atadero died unexpectedly at his home in Miamisburg, Ohio. He was 67. His brother said it followed complications from his recovery from cancer. His obituary lists him as preceded in death by a son, Jaryd J. Atadero. His twin brother Arlin, who had co-owned the resort in the canyon with him, and who had helped him shape a quarter century of grief into a book, delivered the eulogy. He always knew that the day would come when he met Jaryd again, Arlin said. That we know now. So where does the case against any single explanation actually stand today, more than a quarter of a century later? Officially, it is closed. The Larimer County Sheriff's Office concluded that Jaryd Atadero was almost certainly killed by an animal, and the coroner recorded a probable mountain lion attack with the manner of death undetermined. No person has ever been named as a suspect, no one has ever been arrested, and there is no active investigation. Unofficially, and this is simply the truth, nobody knows. The physical evidence recovered in 2003 is consistent with a mountain lion and does not confirm one. The clothing raised questions that were never fully answered. The tooth was destroyed in testing. The lower jaw and nearly the entire body were never recovered. And a search operation involving more than 200 trained people never physically reached the ground where he was lying. That is the whole file, and it is not much for 26 years. And the trail is still there. It still starts at 8,400 feet. It still runs along the upper Poudre through the Comanche Peak Wilderness, and it still has a sign at the head of it with a boy's face on it and some advice about taking children into the mountains. People walk it every summer. Most of them have no idea. Some of them stop at the second campsite and look up at the scree field above the trail and think about it for a while, and then they walk on. Because there is nothing to see, I want to close by going back down the mountain, because I think this story ends in the wrong place if we leave it on a scree field. Go back to the last week of September, 1999, and stand in the gravel lot of a small resort on Highway 14, with the river running behind the cabins. It is late afternoon. The store is open because the store is always open. From 6 in the morning until 11 at night, there is a man behind the counter who is 41 years old and tired in the specific way that single parents are tired, and who has arranged his entire life so that his children are never more than a room away from him. There is a 6-year-old girl doing something at a table, and there is a 3-year-old boy with his shoes on and the laces loose, going out the door and coming back in again for no reason at all, the way small children move through a building. That is the version of this family that existed for one more week. It was a good life. It was, by the standards of anyone who has ever tried to raise 2 children alone, a genuinely well-built life, and it deserves to be remembered as more than the setup to a disappearance. Because behind the case file, and underneath 26 years of theories and television segments and internet arguments about pant legs, there was a real child. Jaryd John Atadero was born on the 2nd of January, 1996. He was 3 years and 9 months old. He weighed 35 pounds. He had brown hair and a smile that shows up in every photograph anyone ever took of him. He hated tying his shoes. He carried a stick when he walked in the woods, because that is what you do when you are 3 and the woods are enormous. He ran ahead of adults and hid behind rocks so he could jump out and say boo, and the adults laughed every time, because that is the deal you make with a 3-year-old. He walked up to strangers and held their hands. The last thing anybody knows for certain that he did was ask 2 men fishing a cold river whether there were any bears in the woods. He was not afraid when he asked it. He was curious. He was having the best morning of his short life, out in front on a big trail on a blue October day, and then he went around a bend and the world closed behind him. He deserved better than that. So did his sister, who heard something she could not identify and has had to carry it since she was 6. So did his father, who spent the rest of his life being asked to explain it and never once pretended he could. Tonight, as you think about Jaryd's story, I would ask you to remember him for the 10 minutes before, rather than for the 10 minutes after. A boy running up a trail with a stick, going faster than everybody, absolutely certain that the people behind him were going to catch up. And if there is anything useful to take from a case this old and this unresolved, I think it is smaller and more practical than the mystery around it. It is that the gap opened slowly. Nobody in that group decided to lose a child. They lost sight of him for 10 minutes, and then they spent an hour looking themselves before telling anyone. And then somebody drove 15 miles down a canyon, and every single one of those choices was reasonable and human and made by decent people who would have given anything to have made them differently. The first hour is the one that counts. That is the entire lesson of the Big South Trail, and it is written on a sign at the trailhead now, because a father who had lost everything decided that the only thing worse than what happened to his son would be it happening again to somebody else. Carry a whistle, wear something bright, and tell someone where you are going. Keep small children in front of you and in sight, not behind you and out of it. And if you are ever the person who realizes that a child is missing, do not spend an hour being brave about it. Send somebody for help in the first 5 minutes, and let the professionals tell you that you overreacted, because they will be delighted to. Jaryd Atadero's cause of death is still recorded as probable. His manner of death is still recorded as undetermined. Almost all of him is still on that mountain, somewhere above the second campsite, in country that nobody has ever fully walked. His father spent 25 years asking what happened, and then stopped asking, and then died. And the two of them are wherever he believed they would be. The trail carries his name now. That is not an answer, but it is the only thing anybody was ever able to give him. And it is more than most missing children ever get. Sleep well, and be careful out there.